What's up, guys? Four-wheeler Doctor back again. We've got a little 650 brute force motor putting back together today. I've got a number of requests on YouTube about getting this thing back together. It's taken me a little while. Just had a whole lot of other irons in the fire, and this guy ain't in a real big hurry for this motor, so I finally got the parts in, and we're gonna get this thing at least started back together today. Hopefully I can get it on by this coming weekend. Today's Sunday, so we'll see if we can't get this together and get it back on the bike and possibly running before the end of the week. So this is a full rebuild. This one had a spun rod bearing. The guy wanted to just go ahead and replace everything so he'd make it just back like it was factory. So what we're going to do first here is let's see if I can zoom in on this. We're going to replace these crank bearings, the rod bearings, I'm sorry, not the crank bearings, they're out here, but the rod bearings. This is a brand new rod, because this rod here, the rod that came out of here was kind of scratched up from where the bearing had actually spun, and these are the yellow bearings. They got a little color snapped on or stamped on the side of it there. All you do with these things is got a tab on it here and a tab there, or a groove cut in there. You just slide that in there like that and push the bearing down. It kind of snaps into place. Do the same thing with the cap. Same setup here. Snap that down in there like that. Press it down. And these caps go on here. They're separate, or they're different. You can kind of see how this has got a little groove cut out to the side here, and the back side's kind of flat. You just want to make sure you get your cap back on there the same direction. So it goes on like that. And these rods have out stamped on them, and that goes toward the outside of the crankcase. So your out would be visible from this side, and then the out would be visible from this side. It doesn't really matter. The rods are the same front or rear, so it really doesn't matter which way you put them on there, but you just have to have that out towards the outside. I like to put a few drops of oil on there just so it's lubed up some, and not when we do get started, not starting dry. So you snap the end cap on like that, and then it has these 12mm nuts on it that hold them on. So hand tighten those down, and then we'll torque those down in a minute. This is actually, you can do this with the crank still in here. I just pressed it out because it had some junk in here. I wanted to clean everything out. But you can do all this with the crank still in the motor. Matter of fact, I've actually changed these rod bearings on one with the crankcase still together, working through the holes here. Nowhere near ideal situation, but it works. So got that one tightened up. I went ahead and installed these bearings in the other rod earlier, so they're snapped in. Put a little oil on those, and I'll just torque all these down at the same time. Like I said, make sure your out faces out on here. And once you get to this point, your end cap will only go on one way, because it's offset a little bit, and it will not fit the other if you go the other way with it. So spin these on a little bit. Let me squeeze over here beside the camera, see what the torque spec is on this. I'll cut the camera back on in a second. Alright guys, these are 34 Newton meters, or 25 foot-pounds is the torque spec on these. This is a 650 bike, like I said in the introduction, but the 750 is pretty well identical to this, aside from the different size cylinders naturally, but the reassembly and disassembly will be the same on both of those. And I also have a video of the disassembly of this. If you want to check that out, I'll put a link up in the top. So check that out, and that'll get you started on taking it apart. This is a very common problem with these Brute motors, spinning the rod bearings. I've had it happen on more than a handful of them, and I'll show you a little later what I think is the main cause of it. But well, I can tell you now, but I can show you later. The left crank bushing, which goes out on this side of the crankshaft, is normally what causes these things to spin. A low oil getting to your rod bearings will make them spin over. So torque these things down. Kind of snug them up first and then hit the final torque with them. Alright, there you go. So that's torqued on. And then next thing you want to do, I'm going to put a little bit of oil on the end. Bring the camera out. Well, you can see it now. So put a little bit of oil on the end of the journal here that slides into this bearing. Sometimes these things will slide right in there. Sometimes they won't. So I don't think this one's going to slide right in. Let me tap on it. I think I got a rubber mount here somewhere. Tap on it with it, see if I can get it in there and get it started. I don't have it going in there square. See if I can lay it back on my little handy dandy engine stand here. See if I can get it to go in there now. There we go, it's sliding down in there now. It really doesn't matter where your rod ends go, because you can change directions on them once you get them in here. But these cylinders are offset a little bit. I don't know if you can tell it or not, but this one's set over farther to the right side of the motor than this one is. So therefore that'll put this being your rear rod and this being your front rod. So spin those around. Like I said before, you can do it while it's still in here, just like that. And so now your rods are in the correct hole, pretty well centered up in these. So alright, so now I've got to tap it down in there a little bit farther, and I'll cut the camera back on right before I get ready to put this transmission back in. Alright guys, hope you can hear me alright. I'll talk a little louder, but I got the fan going. It's just too dang hot today to be working without a fan on. So I got this crank pushed all the way in here, and now the next thing we're going to do, also have the oil screen in. Make sure you include that. It was already in the case, so I didn't have to put it in there. Next thing we're going to do is put the transmission in this thing. I'll usually try to keep it separated in its own box here with a rag on it to try to keep all the gears and everything together. If these things start falling apart, these aren't as bad to figure out how to go back together because there's not that many gears, but some of the Honda ones get real tough. So let me get the camera set up on the stand so you can see how it all goes together, and I'll show you how to stick the transmission in. Alright guys, got the camera up on the stand, so we can start putting the transmission back in this thing. The first part you want to stick on, got a couple of these kind of fell apart in the bag. This shaft here, this is the shaft that actually attaches to your secondary clutch. So you want to stick that one in there along with this shaft here. It does have a washer on the top as well as the secondary clutch one too. So slide both of those in at the same time. The one that goes on your secondary clutch, sometimes it can be a little tougher to get in there. I won't say it's pressed on, but it's a tight fit. See, that's all the way in. So those two mesh up, and then the other gear, well, not gonna do the other gear yet. I'll do the fork, shift fork. The way it goes in here, you do have to take this outer washer, gear, and then there's a roller bearing type thing in there, and then this cog piece here. You can slide it out. What you want to do, it does have a washer on the outside of it here. Go ahead and line your shift fork up, slide it in your shifter hole there, and slide all this stuff back on there together. You do have to get the splines lined up on this one shaft. If you move this washer out of the way, it makes it a little easier to see. So get your splines lined up and wiggle this thing down on there, just like that. Just like that. Then that washer goes on there. Then your bearing, your gear, the gear's facing this direction, and the washer. And then the last remaining gear is this gear here on the shaft, and it slides in this last remaining hole here, just like that. Alright, and that's the transmission install on a brute force. Alright, so everything else is in here. We've got this tube, I didn't ever take it out. Our O-ring here for our coolant is still in. Both of these cases are real clean. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is smear a thin layer of some gray RTV around here, and mesh the two cases up and go ahead and bolt the other crankcase together. So let me get some RTV, and I'll get some smeared on there. I'll cut the camera back on in a sec. Alright guys, I got a thin layer of gray RTV smeared around here. This does have a couple dowels. These don't really come out very often on these motors. You got one here, and then there's still one in the cover here. So just leave those in place and slide this thing back together. You also want to make sure that your rods are in the right position. This rod that's farther away from you is for the rear hole, and the front one here is for the front hole naturally. So slide this back on. You want to be real careful around your crankshaft. Make sure that your chain gears on your crankshaft don't scar up your left crank bushing. There you go. That's almost all the way down. Tap it with a hammer a little bit. Make sure our gear's lining up. That's pretty close. We'll lay it back on the back side so we can go ahead and start putting some bolts in it. Alright, then we'll go ahead and start sticking the bolts in there. The first ones you want to tighten up are these the larger 10mm headed bolts. You've got two here, one here, two here, one here, and then there's a couple around this cylinder up here. Tighten those up or cinch those down first, and you can go around and do the rest of them. I'll get all the bolts in there, and I'll give you a torque spec on what they need to be torqued down to when I cut the camera back on. Alright, got the bolts in here, still got to torque them down. There were 6 of these 10mm headed bolts, 2 here, 2, 1 here, and 1 here, and then 2 here. Those need to be torqued to 20 Newton meters or 14 foot-pounds, and the rest of them are 8mm headed bolts like these. There's a few around this bottom edge, 2 in these 2 holes here, and 2 other ones on the top, and they need to be about 10 Newton meters or about 87 inch-pounds. So I'm gonna get these snug down and then torque them down with a torque wrench, and I'll cut the camera back on when I get everything tightened up. Alright guys, back over here on the right side, we got 3 more bolts to put in. One 8mm headed one up here, torque back to the 10 Newton meters, and then 2 10mm headed bolts. torque those down to the 14 foot-pounds or 20 Newton meters, just like the other side. So let me get those in, and I'll cut the camera back on the next step. Alright guys, next thing we're going to do is put the shifter here together. Shifter linkage, I guess you'd call this. First part you need is this thing here. I didn't take it all apart. I actually still left the bolt in it too. Put some Loctite on it. And I got to answer this phone call. Well, it wasn't that important. Alright, so we got some Loctite on here. I like to start it in there by hand. Like that. And tighten this on up. It is a 6mm Allen head. I'm not sure what the torque spec is, so we're just going to put it in there tight. Alright, next thing you need to do is put a little bit of RTV on your housing. And it's got a metal gasket on it. Really don't have to have RTV on those, but we're still going to put it on. And put a little RTV on both sides and slide it over the shaft. Let me get this ready. It's going to take me a minute to get this RTV squeezed out. Alright, got a little thin coat of RTV on there all the way around. Slide this, slide the cover over your shaft. Sometimes you have to tap that down with a hammer because it's got a little bit of resistance going on. That one slid on pretty easy. And then grab your 3 bolts out of your cardboard. Those are 8mm headed bolts again. As is most of the bolts on this engine is. Very few of them use anything other than 8mm. Torque those down to about 10 Newton meters. Alright, next thing we're going to put in is going to be this stopper that goes in, well, not really stopper, it's what lets the shaft go into each gear. It's a ball. Slide the ball down in there, then you have a spring and this different looking bolt, and it goes in, and there's notches on that shaft, and what that does is just make sure the shaft stops when the ball's in a notch. It makes it go into the correct gear. So just tighten that down. Alright, that's all we got left to do on the back side. Now we're going to spin it on around to this left side. Start with this is called the Bevel Gear in here. Put that back together. This big gear here goes on next. It just slides in, line your splines up. There's no particular way it has to go on there. You just get it to where your splines will line up. Sometimes it can be easier than others. Also, when you install it, make sure this cover goes on the outside. There it goes. Wiggle it around a little bit and it gets your teeth of your gear lined up. And then there's also a snap ring that needs to go on it. Not sure where the snap ring pliers are, but pull out another set. Alright, so put your snap ring on here. Fits in this little groove on the shaft. It goes on pretty easy. I like to rotate those around just to make sure they're in the right place. And then the next part you want to put on, you'll find it in my box of parts here. is the dipstick and gear cover and all that. You like to wipe this thing down. It's magnetized. It'll get some pieces of metal on it from time to time. This bike had a spun rod bearing, so there were some pieces of metal floating around in the engine. And this thing goes on there like that. It's got an O-ring on it. It seals up. Nothing really special to line it up. Just get it close and tap it on with the O so that your O-ring compresses. You may have to rotate this around just a little bit so your bolt holes will line up. Let's see, I'm off a little bit on the bolt hole. Now that it's close. Alright. I'm going to rock this back a little bit. And while I've got that still loose, I'm going to put the oil tube on there as well. And again, I just have to find the tube and the box of parts, I'm sorry. There it is. There's a couple little O-rings on it. Make sure they're all still intact. And it slides on just like this. You've got a bolt here that holds it in, a bolt here that holds it, and this cover in, and then a bolt down here at the bottom. Just push that in, and it'll kind of snap into place. That one's not snapping. There it goes. Alright. Now I'll put all those bolts in. The oil tube, the bevel gear. This one bolt here is a long one. Goes in the top. You have two other longer bolts. They hold this cover on. And then the two 8mm short bolts hold just the bevel tube on. So tighten all those up. And probably don't have to torque them on, but I just like to torque all my bolts on just to make sure I don't leave a loose one somewhere or another. See, that one was a little bit looser. That one's tight. Good there. Good there. Okay. Alright, so we got that on. Next thing we need to put in is probably going to be the shaft, the intermediate chain shaft that goes through here. We'll stick that through and go ahead and lay our cam chains up there and get ready to get the thing halfway timed up. So let me get all the chains together and I'll get them set up and then we'll cut the camera back on. Alright guys, we'll go ahead and feed this thing through here. What you want to do is stick your cam chain for this front cylinder down in the hole and get this to run through the hole to begin with, just to get it started. Make sure your chain is under your shaft there, the intermediate shaft. So stick it up in here like this. Get the chain, or get the shaft going through. You see the shaft stuck through on this side. I like to go ahead and get the chain completely on the gear over here. It kind of helps to hold the whole shaft in. There we go. That's in there. Alright, the next chain that'll need to go on there will be the one for the rear cylinder. Feed it over here as well. And then the last chain, I'm actually reusing those chains. The intermediate chain, or the one that goes from here to the crank, was stretched a good little bit, so I'm going to end up replacing it. This is a new one. Alright, this next thing that goes on will be this gear here, and it goes on this shaft, but in order to get it all on there and all lined up, you have to push that inner shaft back some so it gets some slack in it, so that you can actually get the intermediate chain on there. I done got the chain off my backside back here. What you do sometimes is go back there with a screwdriver and just kind of pry out on the chain a little bit, get it to line up. I'm just gonna hang it right there. All right, let me cut the camera back on in a sec. All right, guys, we're gonna get this thing timed up here. With these bikes, you start with the rear. Always time up the rear cylinder first. So you'd rotate the crank around. I can't do it with my hand, but let me grab something, see if I can spin it around with. What you're trying to do is get the notch where the Woodruff key goes in lined up with that groove, or that raised up portion of the crankcase, I'm sorry, right there. So rotate that around until it lines up with this, and that should be at your top dead center. Well, I guess kind of top dead. That gives you the spot to start with your timing, and then we'll have to time up this top gear with a little notch that's in here. So let me get this spun around. I can't turn it now, and I'll cut the camera back on in a sec. All right, guys, got it twisted around here. You can see where my notch is lined up with the cast spot in the crankcase. The next thing we're going to do is try to get this gear on there and this intermediate chain. The intermediate chain goes on the outside like this, and what you're also trying to do is there's a notch in here, I mean a little dimple knocked in here, and a dimple, not really a dimple, a cast spot right here that you're wanting to line that dimple up on here. This is where it gets, I guess, by far the most complicated part of all this motor assembly. This chain goes on the outside gear of this shaft, but goes on the inside gear of the crankshaft. So our crank should be timed up, and our intermediate shaft, we're gonna have to get some slack in it so we can get this gear on there, because the gear has a keyway in it that has to line up with the keyway on this intermediate shaft. So I'm going to try to get the keyway lined up first, and then we'll worry about getting the gear on the chain on the gear after that. So wiggle it around a little bit. I've got it pretty close to being timed up. And the intermediate shaft just fell out. Okay, so let me show you what I got here. I've got it pretty close to being timed up. You can see the notch. The notch here is halfway lined up with the notch there, and that's probably close enough to get it timed. But now the tricky part is getting the intermediate shaft slid through here while I hold up on this gear. And it's also not a real bad idea to go ahead and get your cam chain on there too, your rear cam chain. Let me slip this off. Okay, rear cam chain's on, intermediate chain's on. everything in here. It's hitting the guide. Rotate it around till our notch is lined up. Close. Right there. Get our chain to go on our crankshaft. See, about a tooth off there, so rotate it around just a little bit more. That's close there. Now I'll get this intermediate shaft to slide through. All while trying to line the notch up in it. Pretty close. Change a little sideways back here. Lift up on it a little bit. There it is. It's sliding together now. Okay. I'll show you what I'm dealing with over here on the back side. See, the intermediate shaft is the chain's inside of it, but it's not on the gear yet. So you're gonna have to wiggle that around, and what I usually do is try to pick up on the chain here to get it to go around this gear, and then it'll slide together. I know this sounds very, very, very complicated, but it's really not. It just takes a little bit of patience to get everything timed up right. There you go, wiggle it around. Intermediate shaft is almost all the way in there. The only thing that's keeping it from going in now is our chains hitting on the back side. I'll take a small screwdriver and stretch that chain around the gear so that the shaft will go on in deeper. There it is. You really don't have to worry about trying to time nothing up on this back side yet. Actually, it all kind of times everything together with this shaft. So it's all the way in there. We've got our notch is on our, we got our notch lines up with the crank. That notch right, that groove right there. We've got the dimple on our gear here. The dimple right here. Lines up with that cast area on the back there. And then we've got our intermediate shaft all the way in with the gear on it. So that's what we wanted. Everything seems to be timed up right. So what I like to do now is there is a snap ring that goes on that outside. Go ahead and throw that on there just to make sure everything stays together. Outside of that intermediate shaft. Have to push in on the shaft a little bit. There you go, it snaps in there. One other thing you want to check and make sure is that this chain stays on that gear right there for that rear cylinder. If that thing comes off, it's real tough to get back on there. I've actually had to take this back apart before, or take one back apart before that the chain come off and I couldn't get it to go back on. Alright, next thing to go in is this little plate. It slides behind those gears on the intermediate shaft. Push in on the shaft and it'll slide up in there. And then there's two Allen head bolts that go in on it. Put some Loctite on those. And tighten those down to about the same 10 Newton meter torque. So put those in with your finger tight first, and then we'll torque them down. It's a 5mm Allen head. That locks everything in. Hit it with the torque wrench. Alright, next item we're going to tighten up is this cam chain guide. We had took the bolt out of it and loosened that guide up. It makes it a lot easier to get the shaft off or get the chain off when we took it apart. So we'll loosen this bolt back up, slide that guide back over, and put the bolt back in. Let's see if I got the right side of the Allen. Yes, it's a 6mm on that one. I don't know if it requires it or not, but we're going to put a dab of Loctite on that as well. Drop it one time, then pick it back up, and try to stick it in there again. There you go. Second time's a charm. Alright, so tighten that down. And the last thing we want to put on this side over here to make sure everything stays into time, it doesn't jump time while you're putting cylinders and stuff on, is this intermediate tensioner. Goodness gracious, this thing got a half a mile of threads on it. There we go. Alright, next thing we need to put in, oh, this cat-like reflex has caught the camera. This is the tensioner. Just have to find it. In my bucket of bolts. Bucket of parts, I'm sorry. Let me cut the camera back on. I don't want y'all waiting on me to find parts. Alright guys, found the tensioner. The way this one works is you push your fingernail on this little wrapped up piece here and then push the plunger in, and it exposes a hole on the back side back here. Stick your piece of wire in there and it holds the tensioner closed. And grab a couple of bolts, stick in it. So run those two 8mm headed bolts down. Got them tightened up. Torque them down just to be sure. And pull your wire out. There you go. It snaps open. You can see where it put tension back on our chain. Next thing we need to do will be put the oil pump in. I believe I got gears to replace the pump gears on here to make sure we're getting good oil pressure on these. So let me grab the gears out and I'll show you how to swap those out and put it on. Alright guys, I'm going to show you how to rebuild this oil pump. There's just a little E-clip on the end of this shaft here. Take a small screwdriver and you can pop that off. And then the gears come right out. The inner and the outer. You can see they're scratched up a little bit. I really don't like to take any chances with them, so I'll go ahead and replace those. And that way you don't have to worry about any kind of oil pressure issues. So there's the new one, there's the new one. So you take and just, there's a little notch on the shaft. Just line that notch up with your new gear. God, I'm sorry, but the memory card filled up on that one, and I didn't realize it until I already had this thing bolted up. So where it cut off, I was putting that inner gear in there and slip the outer one out, snap the E-clip on, and then you want to put this cam chain guide in here. It goes in this bottom bolt hole. There's a dowel inside of it. Make sure you put that in. It has a long bolt that goes with it. Then there's two other 8mm headed bolts that go in the other two holes on the cam chain, on the oil pump. Torque those down, and the tensioner for this thing is just a 14mm headed bolt. It does have an O-ring in there. Make sure you have that in there. This little looks like a bullet and a spring, and it's just kind of tension with the spring. So you put that in like that, tighten it up. See if I can find me a 14mm. That will put tension on your oil pump chain. I very seldom have those get stretched out. I've had to replace a number of the timing chains, both the intermediate chain and the regular cam chains. But the oil pump chain, see, it's got a lot of tension on it. It's still good. I very seldom change those out. Alright, so the next thing we need to do is get our pistons on. Go ahead and mount those up, and I'll get everything together for that and cut the camera back on in a sec. Show you how to get your piston pin in and your rings on your piston. Alright guys, I got the piston cleaned up here. We're just going to reuse these pistons. This bike hadn't been too long ago rebuilt, so these pistons and everything actually in pretty good shape. If it hadn't spun a rod bearing, it wasn't any issue with the piston that made it spin a rod bearing. So I just had this one marked as the rear piston, but you do want to make sure that F mark goes toward the front of the bike. Make sure the valve reliefs match up right. Alright, so I got the pin pushed in. I did put a little oil in it to help it slide in. You want to shove your rag in there. I've preached this numerous times. When you're putting this pin in, or this clip in, 9 times out of 10, if it slips out, it's going to fall into the crankcase, and you don't want to have to take the crankcase back apart just to get this pin out, or try to turn it over or wiggle it around or get some kind of way to get the thing out of there. So just shove your rag in there. Save you a lot of headache. Speaking from experience. So I got the pin pushed in, or the clip pushed in. That should be good to go. Didn't lose it, which is always good. And now we need to do our rings. I'm going to put new rings in it. Alright guys, I got the rings for this thing. Had a little problem. I didn't realize that this guy had put the 750 pistons and rings and cylinders and all that in here, and it's actually a 650 bottom end, a 650 bike. So I had ordered the wrong rings for it. So I've got some 750 ones here now that'll work. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to put these in. This is what you wind up with when you get a ring set. This is the you've got 5 rings here: top, middle, the oil ring, and then the 2 little rings that go over top and the bottom of the oil ring. The way you put these things in is you put the this little oil scraper thing here first, and I usually stick it in, and to pay attention to where the cracks are in them. The crack for it is here toward the front. It doesn't matter if you do front, rear. Really, I don't think it matters a whole lot where you put it on the piston, just as long as you don't let the cracks line up. So then this next ring, doesn't matter if it goes on top or bottom of that oil ring. I usually kick them off just a little bit. So it is, the gap for it is over here in this 12 o'clock in about the 2 o'clock position. And then the next ring goes in on the top of the oil scraper in my case, and I've got it about 11 o'clock. Alright, so now the top and the middle ring. The top ring has an R stamped on it. Not sure if you can see that or not. An R, and the middle ring has an RN. Make sure the RN faces up, and the RN's the next one we're going to put on, the middle ring, and I'm going to leave the gap for it here at the 12 o'clock position, and the gap for the R ring at the 6 o'clock position. And just barely stretch these things over to get them over the piston. Some people use ring separators, but I don't think they're really needed. You can do it with your hand. So got that in there, so now it's ready to put the cylinder back in on these bikes. I don't really know if it does any good or not. I didn't have the cylinders recoated on here, so what I'm going to do is just take my hone and run the hone up and down through here just a little bit. It's got a little bit of rust on there where the bike was sitting for a while, so I'm gonna run my hone up and down there just to scratch it up a little. Then I'll clean it out with some dish detergent and warm water, and stick them back on. So let me get these things cleaned up, and I'll cut the camera back on when I get ready to put them back on. Alright guys, got these cylinders cleaned up. Like I said, I hit them with the hone. I don't really know how much that does with these nickel seal coated ones, but it does clean them up a little bit. This motor's been sitting a little while, so there was a little bit of oxidation on the inside. I did honed it and cleaned it with dish soap and warm water, and also then cleaned it with some transmission fluid. That really helps to get any of the grit out of the little scratches that it left in it. Also, got a new gasket on here. We're going to slide it down on here in the back side. These base gaskets do not require any kind of sealant, because I've had problems with. How y'all doing? Good. How are you? Good. Had problems with them squishing out. So put a little bit of oil in the cylinder and take a small screwdriver and press these rings in as you go down, and they'll usually slide right on there. The key to these Brute motors is to start in the rear. You need to do everything with your rear cylinder before you move to the front one, at least from a timing perspective and putting the cylinders on and all that stuff. So we're going to start with this rear one, like I said, and feed the timing chain up, get the piston up into place. You can halfway squeeze these rings in with your hand, because there is a little relief on each side of the cylinder that will let you push that down. We might be lucky enough on this one to push them all down in there. It usually doesn't happen. You usually have to resort to that small screwdriver, but hey, all the stars are lined up today, and I did it with my hand. So just kind of rock it down on there. Make sure your dowels are in. There's 2 dowels that go in the bottom of this of the cylinder, and make sure you got your cam chain up out of there. So just keep on rocking this thing down and tap it down. There you go. Now it's seated up. You can go ahead and stick the 3 bolts in it, the 3 8mm headed bolts, and then you'll be ready for your head gasket. Let me get those things ready, and I'll cut the camera back on in a sec. Alright guys, we've got the cylinder on there now. Got our wire hooked to our timing chain. So now the next thing we're going to do is get ready to put this head on. First thing you should do is make sure you put your little metal tube back in there, a little oil tube. It's got a little hole down in there that it sits into, and you can lube up those little O-rings, but they seem to be pretty well lubed on there now. I did shoot some copper seal on the head gasket. Got that here, and this does have 2 dowels. They're opposite one another on the heads. So you slide your gasket over there. Those dowels will help hold it in place. Actually, before I put that on there, we do need to put the timing chain guide. That guide has an F and a R marked on the side of it. The R is for the rear side, and it hooks into a little tab on the left side of the motor here. You can kind of look through the side there and see when it hooks in, and then put your top part in goes just like that. Now you slide your head gasket on over all of this stuff, just like that. And I clean this head up. Normally I would change the valve seals on these things, but in this case this bike hadn't been too long ago taken down and done a top end on, so I'm not gonna mess with them. It's not smoking or anything. So now you just slide these over, fish your wire up through this hole to keep tension on your cam chain. You also want to make sure that that chain stays on that gear in there, that intermediate shaft gear, because if it comes off, it's real tough to get back on, especially once you got the head on. So you got to get all kind of stuff lined up here. The two dowels and that metal oil tube, and looks like I pretty much about got it on there. I'm gonna have to tap it with a hammer just a little bit. There we go, that's on there. And then your bolts will be next. You got an 8mm bolt up here at the top, and then these big ones, your head bolts. You want to shoot a little bit of oil on the threads and on the washers of these things. Just helps you get a consistent torque. Feed those in and turn them a couple times to make sure you don't get them cross-threaded. And do that to all four. Feed them in. And then those things, the way they're torqued down, you torque them all to one spec and then tighten them down a little bit more. The torque spec on these things, the first torque will be 25 Newton meters, which is 18 foot-pounds. This is just on the big bolts. And then the final torque will be 49 Newton meters or 36 foot-pounds. So your final torque will be 36. And what I normally do is torque all those down and then come back and hit this one to about that 10 Newton meters that I tighten all these little bolts up with. So let me get those tightened up and I'll cut the camera back on right before I put the cam in. Alright guys, we're ready to get this cam in here. It's still timed up from where we put the intermediate shaft in, but what you want to do is get the little notch in where your Woodruff key goes in there, lined up with that that little groove that's got that little, well, it's not an indentation, it's a raised up spot in the case. And then also make sure that your dimple in this gear is lined up with that little God, let me see if I can get a little bit dimmer flashlight if there's such a thing. So it's so bright you can barely see it. That little indentation, you can barely see it right there. Make sure it's lined up with this, and everything should be lined up right. And then the next thing you want to do is put your cam in. The rear cam on these have a line, a groove in them. That's how you can tell, and also you can tell because I put an R on it. But this little piece right here that kind of looks like a washer, it's got a little groove down the very center, and that's the rear cam. The cams are different on these, so make sure you get that in right. And what you're wanting to do is get these two tick marks lined up with the side of the head here, as well as that arrow pointing up. So pull up on your cam chain good, slide this thing in here. Sometimes these cam chain guides can be a little tough to get around. I'm gonna go ahead and take this wire off here, because you won't ever get it on there with the wire on it. So work this cam chain around the decompression mechanism out on the end there. There we go. There it is. Alright, so I got my cam pretty well lined up to where it needs to go. You can kind of lay it over towards yourself and slide the chain on. And it's kind of tough to get it. If it's one tooth off, it's going to be off a whole lot. So you can see we're off just a little bit here. on our tick marks. You can see that tick mark, but you can't see that one. But if you stick your finger in the tensioner hole, it lines it up better. So that's dead on right there. That's what we need. So now we need to put the rocker arm, I don't really know what these things are called, rocker arm covers. It ain't a valve cover because those are up here. So whatever this thing is, spray it out with a little brake clean because it's a little bit dirty on the inside. And then put a layer of RTV around the edge of it and just pop this down on there. It does have 2 dowels, make sure they're in there. So let me get this RTV'd up and then I'll cut it back on right before I tighten those bolts because the torque spec's different on a few of the bolts on the top. So cut it on in a second. Alright guys, like I said before, I don't really understand why, but these bolts in the very center here have less torque on them than the ones on the outside. The ones in the very center have about a 9 Newton meters. I would give you foot pounds, but it's actually less than a foot. So actually not. It's like 78 inch pounds is what it calls for. So that's not less than a foot. But so about 8 Newton meters on these, and then the 8mm headed ones bolts call for 10 Newton meters. So just get those torqued down, and then we will put the tensioner in. Alright guys, next thing we're going to do is stick the tensioner in there. This is your tensioner here. I go ahead and loosen these middle bolts up before I take them off. It just makes it a lot easier because you have to put this in a vise and it's tough to hold on to. So take that apart. There's a washer, a spring, and a little straight piece of metal in there. Make sure you keep all that stuff together. And then this is your tensioner is extended. Push this little ramp piece down and push the plunger in with your hand, and then the tensioner will slide right in there. Just like that. So what you do is take the 2 8mm bolts, tighten them up, and then slide your spring with the metal piece inside of it and this other little bolt down in there, and that puts tension back on your cam chain. Alright, I'll cut the camera back on in a sec when we get ready to start the front cylinder. Alright guys, now we're ready to do the front end. I haven't moved this any since we did the rear, so the rear's timed up, got the tensioner in and all that. So now we got to rotate this thing. The manual says clockwise 270 degrees. I figure that's probably pretty accurate. So what we're trying to do is get from this little line here, spin it around clockwise to line up with this line here, which is on about the close to 11 o'clock position here. So I'm gonna probably have to do this with 2 hands. So let me sit the camera down, and I'll show you the finished product once I get it spun around. If I can get it spun around with my hand. What you do, sometimes they'll spin if you grab both sides and rotate it like that, and then eventually it gets to where it wants to stop, kind of like that right there. So you got to put something over here to rotate this. And what I use a lot of times is a pair of pliers. Open them way up. It doesn't have a whole lot of tension on it, but it's more than you can do with your hand. And you don't want to really torque down on this because you do have your flywheel that clamps on it, so you don't want to mess your crank up. But pretty light pressure. The biggest thing is you just can't grab onto this because it's a smooth shaft, and get it to rotate. Alright, coming on around. Keep pulling on your cam chain there because you don't want it to get kinked up. Alright, pretty close there. Go just a little bit more, and we'll have it. That's pretty close. Okay, so there we've got the keyway lined up with that notch there, and there's also one more thing you can check. This is on the other side, on the right side of the engine. There is a line, a little tick mark right here on this gear, on this intermediate shaft gear. Bear with me, let me get the camera right. On the intermediate shaft gear, if you can see it, there's a tick mark right here. on the gear, and then this little tick mark, this little arrow thing, you can line those up and you can see that's lined up good too. So that shows you the rear chain should be at where we would get top dead center. So now we need to put our rings on here just like the other side. Rings, and we already got the base gasket in there. I'm probably not going to show me putting all this back together because it's pretty much a repeat from the back side. So I'll cut the camera back on when I get ready to do this stuff in the side cover, but I'm gonna go ahead and throw this head and all this back on here on the front. Alright guys, I got the top heads on. We're going to adjust the valves on that in a little while, but now I'm going to go ahead and start getting this stuff together on the left side. Start off with, we need to put the starter in. To get it in, I removed 3 of those bolts on this snorkel vent for the belt, and just loosen that one up so it'll swing out of the way, and then that'll allow your starter to slide in here just like that. You just push it in until your bolt holes line up and bolt that up. Well, I'll bolt that up later, but next thing you need to stick in is the flywheel. So your flywheel, this is a new crankshaft, so it doesn't come with a Woodruff key, so you line your key up in there. I'm gonna see if I can knock this thing in here with one hand. Look at there, just like that. Tap that in there, and then slide your flywheel on, lining up your groove there with the groove that's in the crank, and then put this gear here, which these things are very expensive. You can buy them cheap off of eBay. If you buy one new from Kawasaki, that part's about $200. Kind of crazy. But sometimes you got to slide your flywheel out just a hair to get that to go in there, but it bolts up in there like that. And what I like to do on these, go ahead and stick the bearing that goes on here. Go ahead and slide it on. Most of the time you got to kind of tap it on to get it to go down over the crank. The cranks are pretty tight. As in this case, very tight. There you go. That seats up. And then grab your bolts. There's the bolt. And there's one other piece that I don't see. Yeah, let me find this other piece. There's a part that goes on here that will push this on. I like to run that in there tight just so it squeezes the flywheel on there. That way when you put this cover on, the magnetic pull from the stator doesn't suck it off. So let me find that other part, and I'll cut the camera back on in a sec. Alright guys, here's the little part here. I just hit record on the camera, and it didn't start recording, so I just talked and did all this a while ago and didn't even record it. So this is the part. Slide it on here. It's actually supposed to have a little keyway that goes in here. I'm not going to worry about that right now because we're going to have to take this back off, but I just want to put the bolt in. I'll run this in with the impact, back all that back off just to lock that flywheel on, because I've had them before. You get ready to slide that left cover on and it'll pull the flywheel off, and sometimes it gets off your Woodruff key and all that, so it makes a mess. It's a lot easier to just go ahead and do it now, and you don't have to worry about it coming off. So let me get this tightened up. I'll back it all back off, and I'll cut the camera back on right before I put the left crankcase cover on. Alright guys, got everything cleaned up here. So I got a new gasket. I usually try to replace these gaskets whenever I do one of these motor builds. This thing does have 2 dowels here and here. So I don't know if the dowels come off in your cover or come off in here. So if they stayed in here, that's good. I like to try to leave those in there so it helps to line the gasket up, because if you have them dowels in that cover slide on there, sometimes the dowel will get, or the gasket will get kicked off and end up messing your gasket up because you try to press that dowel in there to it. So as far as putting this cover back on, it's pretty easy. You just pretty much slide it over. And I'm going to clean up this gasket material on this water pump housing. Hopefully the compressor won't come on. Let me hit this real quick. Clean that water pump gasket up. None of the seals on this side were leaking or anything, so I'm not going to replace any of those. Also, since this is one of these metal type gaskets, I don't put any RTV on these. And you just line this up over your oil pump shaft. See, I done knocked the gasket off already. So line it up on your oil pump shaft. Get it back in your little dowels there. And just slide this thing over. You kind of may have to wiggle it back and forth to get it over that oil pump shaft. Pretty much just like that. And got it off just a little bit. See, it's a little tough to work with this since the stator is trying to pull with its magnetic pull here. So that's lined up. Make sure the other one's lined up. Yep, we got the gasket all the way around, so we're good there. Alright, so now we got to stick all these bolts in, torque them down to that normal 10 Newton meters that we do all the other small bolts with. And want to make sure you put this piece back on. I usually try to stick that little keyway into a bag because it's super small, and it's very easy to lose. They also bad to shear off too. People use pull start very often, but the little keyway is super small. So just line your two slots up there. A lot of times you have to tap that thing in with a hammer. See, that's how you lose it right there. You just drop it in the floor and hope you can find it again. Well, I might have just lost it. Nope. Found it again. So get this thing lined back up. I'll see if I can get me a hammer and tap that in there. Just like that. And then this piece here goes on there too. There's two pins that stick out there. That's what the pull start engages into. Then you tighten that nut up. So or bolt up, I'm sorry. So let me get all those tightened up and I'll cut the camera back on right before I put the water pump cover on. Alright guys, next thing we need to do is stick the water pump together. This is the impeller. It just screws right on here. It's a 10mm hex head in there that holds it on. And I believe, where's the torque wrench? It goes to about that same 10 Newton meters torque on there. Alright. I do have a new gasket for this water pump. Whenever I do these builds, I really just like to replace these metal type gaskets. And the water pump housing, I'm going to have to clean that up a little bit because the old one's got a lot of residue still stuck on it. But you do want to hang on to these little dowels. They're very, very small. One goes in here. Like that. Might have to tap that in with a hammer, and the other one goes here. And those help keep your gasket lined up. Just like that. And then you put your gasket on there like this. Not like that. Put it on there like this. And then let me clean this up with some Scotch-Brite and pretty much just bolt this thing on. And that'll be pretty much it for everything putting back on here, with the exception of the clutches. I do have to put the clutches on, and then I'm also going to adjust the valves on this. So I'll show you how to do the valves on it as soon as I get this water pump put on. Alright guys, next thing we need to do is put this front tensioner in, just like the rear one. I already had the 12mm bolt loosened up on it, so take it out. Grab the washer, the spring, and that little flat piece of metal, or round piece of metal. Push the little ramp part in, and push your plunger in back like that. Slide this in. It just has an O-ring, so you don't have to worry about doing any kind of sealing or anything on it. And then get your bolts started. Run those in and put your 12mm bolt back in the center and tighten it up, and that's all you got to do to get the tensioner back in. Alright guys, now we're going to try to get this thing top dead center so we can adjust these valves. It's probably pretty close right now, but I'm still going to rotate it around just to show you how to get it there if you happen not to have yours in there now. Alright, first off, I know this is kind of a little bit different, but the way you, I don't know if you remember when we put this thing together, you timed it up with the rear cylinder first and then went around to the front. Well, now when you adjust the valves, you do the front cylinder first and then spin it around and do the rear. I know that sounds kind of odd, or sounds kind of trivial, but it makes a difference which one you time up first or adjust the valves on first, just because the way the motor fires and rotates and all that. So what we want to do is rotate this thing around using the 19mm crank bolt. We're going to rotate it until this the intake valve goes down and comes back up. You will be rotating it counterclockwise. So let me rotate this thing around. So the exhaust valve just opened and closed. Now the intake valve is open and closing. And once it closes, start looking in your timing hole over here for your marks. And I come across a tick mark, and then another looks like a little T with an R below it, so that's for the rear head. And we're looking for the tick mark with the F. There it is right there. So there's a little tick mark, and then it almost looks like a real short T and an F, and that's what you're looking for. You may be able to see this. This one's you can see it a little bit better than some of the ones in the Hondas. Let me see if I can get some light on the situation. Get the camera to focus a little bit. Well, it won't focus that close. Come on, baby. I believe you can see it. About right there. There's looks like a T and then an F. So that means that then we're ready to do our valves on our front cylinder. And the clearances on these things, the book says to go between 0.2 and 0.25 millimeters on the exhaust, and 0.1 to 0.15 millimeters on the intake. And I usually try to tighten these things down on the loose or looser side, because these valves always seem to get tighter over time. They starts pulling the valves up in the intake ports and the exhaust ports just as the valves wear out. I've had them break off and stuff like that too. So I just try to get them on the looser side. So we're gonna go, I guess we might try to hit it kind of in the middle. 0.009 is what we're going to go on the exhaust, and the intake will be 0.005. Those are inch measurements, I'm sorry. I can't find my 5. There it is. Okay, so I got our two feeler gauges here. 0.009. I can barely read this feeler gauge. And 0.005, which is 1.2 millimeters, and 1.2 millimeters and 0.2, I think that's 0.23 millimeters. I can't hardly read it on here. Anyway, the thicker ones goes to the exhaust, as far as I've known every time. So slide this thing in here, and you want to see if you got any clearance. These are tight. Check the exhaust. Yeah, the exhaust are pretty close to being, well, they need some adjustment too, but the intakes are very tight, so we need to adjust them back. These adjusters on these things have a square head on them, which is different than like the Hondas and stuff that I usually do. And the square head, the thing I found, the easiest thing I found to turn that thing with is a deck screw. I actually took one and bent it with a square square drive on it, and it will fit right on there. I know that's a little bit ghetto, but hey, it works. So you break that adjuster screw loose, or break the adjuster nut loose, and then take that thinner filler gauge, slide it under there. It won't even go. So there we go. You just want a little bit of resistance on it, and I like to hold that adjuster in place while I still got the feeler gauge in there. There we go, that's good. Won't slide in on this side. So get a little resistance, and then tighten up your lock nut. Alright, see how that feels. Yep, both of them have got a little resistance to them. The exhaust ones, I think we got one that's real loose and one that's not so loose. Yeah, both of them are going to have to be tightened up a little bit. So break that adjuster same exact way as you do on the intake. Okay. And I'll have to tighten it up just a hair. Hold it still. Feels good. I like for it to be just a slight drag on there, nothing that you've got to force it to get in there, and also one that doesn't just slide right around. So I like to have a little bit of drag in it. See, that one's still just a little bit loose. Hit it one more time. Alright, that's good. Alright, and then now what you want to do is rotate this around to get the rear head ready, rear valves ready. And I'll run this camera down a little bit so you can see them. Alright, so there's our rear intakes. Same exact thing. We're going to rotate it around till the intake valve opens and closes, and then start looking for your TR mark then. So they're open now. Now they're closing. And start looking in the hole here. There's one mark, there's another mark, and then there's the T and the R mark, identical to the front. You also can check these things, especially on one that you know, you're just adjusting the valves on to that you hadn't took the motor apart. They should have play in both of the valves. These are tight, so we're still at the right position, right top and center on the compression stroke, but these valves here are just tight. So need to do the exact same thing with them, and I don't think I'm gonna video all this, but same deal. Just break your lock nut loose. They're very tight. Slide your feeler gauge in there. These are the intake side because it's where the carburetors bolt up. Easy way to remember that. And I got to find my feeler gauge again. Okay, so 0.05. That one's pretty good. And see, that one's a little tight. So get your screw, adjust that out, do the exact same thing with the back, and you'll have the valves adjusted. I still got to spin this thing around. There's a couple more or a couple pieces I got to put on the other side behind the clutches before I put the clutches on. So I'll cut the camera back on in just a sec once I get these done and spin this thing around. So I'll cut it on in just a sec. Alright guys, last few things we got to stick in here are the plug right here over that timing chain. If you remember or not, when we pull this thing off, we did stick a nut, a bolt in there. You just slide that in there. You do have to tap that in with a hammer, like that. And then this clutch back plate goes on next. 3 bolts on it. Make sure this tab thing here goes over top of that cover that you just put on. And there's 3 8mm headed bolts that hold it on. And this thing here has got some issues with some belt cover bolts broken off. Some of the threads are stripped out, so I'm gonna work on them for a little bit. See if I can get that broke piece out and maybe tap a few of them out, because it's leaked in here. You can actually see where this mud got past the cover, and that's not really by the snorkel. It looks like it come in from the bottom. So I'm not gonna put the clutches on this thing until I put it back together, so make it a little easier for me to pick up and put in the bike. So I won't do those. I probably won't do a video on that because they're pretty easy to get back in. So I will probably do another video, or cut the video right back on right before I crank this thing up, just because everybody wants to see the first start up, and I'll let you see it on here. So I'll cut the camera back on when I get it in the bike. Alright guys, I almost got this thing all the way back together, but at least I got it far enough to try to crank up right now. So I'm going to try to get the first crank on here, like everybody wants to see these. Get this thing down where the camera won't fall off in case it gets to shaking. Bear with me a sec. Oh, this thing is crooked. Politician. Alright, there you go. That'll be a good shot. Sometimes these things have to turn over a little bit to get started, because this does have a vacuum actuated pump. It does have snorkels on it, so we'll take the snorkel caps off, because it will not crank with a snorkel cap on. Speaking from experience there. Alright, give it a little choke. Well, this one didn't take but a second to crank. There you go. Fired up. I don't really know what it sounds like on the camera, but it's pretty quiet here. No ticking, no rattling. Sounds like it's running smooth. Alright guys, now we got to get these 10,000 screws and bolts on to hold all this plastic on. And this is another one that's done. So guys, check out my other videos, like, subscribe. Help me out. I need to get some subscribers on these videos. My subscriber count's so low. I might have said that at the first of this video, but if you made it this far, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Help me out. Alright guys, you have a good night.